Tina, it's such a thrill to have you here. Thank you so much for coming to Clifton.
I hope this works. Is this working or not? I feel it may not be. Hello, Mr. Sound Person. This is not working.
Is this working?
This is not working. Is this working now?
Okay.
Thank you.
Now, it seems odd to describe the global doyenne of magazines, indeed of all journalism, as ever having been a local girl anywhere. But Tina Brown, you were raised less than 5 miles from here.
Indeed.
Today, I hope we will discover how you made the meteoric journey from Little Marlow to the heights of Manhattan. Your father, film producer George Brown, described you as a strange girl, impatient to leave your childhood behind.
I think he was pretty impatient for me to leave it behind too, actually.
Via several boarding schools where you distinguished yourself by your sheer mischief, and Oxford, where your star quality was already becoming apparent, you were catapulted into the editorship of Tattler at the age of 25, where you injected the horsey, dusty Dowager's album with so much glamour and wit that it became the glitterati handbook. You shook it from irrelevance to irreverence. And from there, Newhouse recruited you to perform life support on Vanity Fair, which you turned into the defining chronicle of the celebrity culture. And then you breathed life into the New Yorker before leaving to found Talk magazine with some film producer called Harvey, before founding the digital news site Daily Beast, attempting to salvage Newsweek, and kicking off the spectacular Women in the World conference series as founder and CEO. You call them live journalism. And somehow, in between all that, you found time to write by far the most entertaining book ever written about Princess Diana, available in our bookshop in paperback, and Tina will be signing copies after this, and to keep a diary. You are set to thrill readers again with your forthcoming account of your years at Vanity Fair, available pre-order on Amazon from Orion. You have been variously described as Queen of Happeningness, and by your husband, fellow writer and editor's legend Harry Evans, as having rat-like cunning. He also said he identified with Pride and Prejudice's forbearing Mr. Bennet. Perhaps we can start with the great Newhouse, who died 2 weeks ago, and who you so touchingly described in a recent piece in which you talked about how he transformed Condé Nast into a prestige powerhouse. And you wrote that every writer, reader, and editor should mourn his passing. Can you tell us a bit more about Cy?
Yes, it was very, very sad that Cy Newhouse died aged 89, like 2 weeks ago. He'd had a very, very long, terribly stressful illness. He had a kind of an Alzheimer brain issue for some years. And it, just the tributes to him just sort of brought back to me, how you never really know you're in a golden era till it's over. And his, tenure, his chairmanship of Condé Nast in the 80s, 90s, and into the mid-2000s really allowed so many great editors to do their best work. He had a fantastic eye for talent. He was incredibly modest and shy himself, but he loved editors with star quality who he would then, promote and push out and give them the funds and give them the vehicle, in a sense, to do their best work. And he only ever really wanted quality. He was always pushed for quality. So he's incredibly rare because, how often can one say that to be true now? And, of course, as the world of magazines has now gone into meltdown, you can look back on that period as something that's really quite extraordinary. And in a way, his death comes at a moment when there's just such a watershed moment in media that a lot of people have suddenly realized, the significance of him in the sort of media history.
Interesting. And you told that lovely story about his lack of ego, about how he told you couldn't get hold of one of his editors or something.
Yeah, we had a lovely sort of ruminative conversation once going back from lunch in the car, and he said to me, nobody, there isn't really such a thing as having power. I said, well, what do you mean? Here's this enormously powerful man who owns all these magazines. And he said, well, the American president doesn't really have power. Congress can thwart him. He said, if I told people at Random House, which he also owned, to buy certain books, they wouldn't follow that for more than 5 minutes. If I told editors of the magazines I own, that they should print things, they would just ignore me. And then as we went in, he just said, I find it very hard to get the editor of the New Yorker on the phone. And I just thought, he was like a Thurber character. He was a sort of an anti-hero who was so modest and shy, but had all this power,
Amazing. And so he first spotted you at Tattler, and I'm very struck, having been there myself, how you managed to turn this thing round, and you were only 25. How did you know what to do with it when you were so young? Where did that...
Well, for a start, I mean, for me, Tattler was like a school magazine, to forget when I took it over. I mean, there was only 10 people on the staff, a few sort of faded debs, a girl who was sitting there selling classified advertising, except there wasn't any classified advertising, so it was a very limited job. And I just hired all my friends, as one does on the school magazine, in a sense. And, but I did have a concept for it, I had to say. I mean, I have always been a magazine junkie and in love with the DNA of great magazines. I collected magazines, I worshipped magazines, I read magazines. And I loved the idea that Tattler had this coffee house history in the days of Jonathan Swift and Addison and Steele, and yet also then had evolved into being this 20s social society sheet. And I thought I wanted to wed the two Tattlers, in a sense, the literary, sparkling, irreverent sort of coffee house sort of pamphlet of the 18th century, with the social sort of relevance of the weekly, very jazzy Tattler of the 30s and 40s, and created something that was sort of a combination of both, but with a modern spin, so that it was a very irreverent look at society, but it also had wonderful writers, like, from the very first issue we had Martin Amis, who was, very young then, and Auburn Moore and Julian Barnes, and all of these wonderful writers always wrote for Tattler right from the beginning. But visually, it was very alive and very irreverent.
Yes, you're right. Thinking about that, the Addison and Steele Tattler was incredibly hard-hitting and newsy, and then you added those, you combined with that sort of glitzy party scene that became...
Right, and also, I mean, I think for magazines to really succeed, they have to hit the zeitgeist, and, I took over the same month that Mrs. Thatcher took over Downing Street. So we were suddenly at a point when, the malaise of the 70s and the whole kind of socialist... 3-day week and all the stuff that had been going on, England had been in a very down-in-the-mouth mood. And suddenly Mrs. Thatcher came in and said, now we're going to live in a world where we can sack people again, And there was a kind of wonderful sort of, all the upper classes sort of came out of their stately homes where they'd been hiding, in their sort of gumboots, as it were, and thought, right, we're back. And so that, of course, wonderful for a social magazine called The Tattler. So people were giving parties again. And then, of course, we got the great story of all times, which was the rise of the Princess of Wales. So we had the story, the biggest social story since Mrs. Simpson was the rise of, Diana Spencer and the romance with Prince Charles, which we covered like CNN covered O.J. Simpson.
Yeah.
I mean, that was our story and we owned it.
Yes. You explained her, really,
all the way through. And of course, a lot of my staff, knew her and were sort of not much older than her, really.
Yeah.
So it was a perfect story for the perfect time.
And then, interestingly, in parallel, I mean, I'd love to hear you talk about how your transition into Vanity Fair, because I know you left her, but she sort of turned herself from a Tattler girl to a Vanity Fair girl, didn't she?
Absolutely right. This is what was so interesting, and in the end why I wrote a book about it, because she always was sort of on the zeitgeist of what I was also doing at the time, so that at the time that I took over Vanity Fair, I mean, I was the person who broke the story in a sense of the marriage going wrong and doing like Dynasty Di, and as we call Dynasty Di now in England, showing how she turned into this very 80s sort of power woman with dresses with big shoulders and red nails and the big hair and all the rest of it. She did change along with the era.
Yes.
And, we also saw the collapse of the marriage at that time, which was an extraordinary Vanity Fair ongoing story.
Yes.
I wrote the piece, The Mask That Roared.
I remember very well.
And in fact, the Daily Mail did what the Daily Mail loves to do, which is to pretend to be aghast at the story and then completely rip it off.
Of course.
And do Harry and I's marriage in exactly the same terms. It was very funny. And it said how Harry was used to be the James Bond of journalism, and I'd turned into the Joan Crawford of, it was very funny, actually, as only the Mail can be.
And so you took Tattler to a point that Condé Nast wanted to buy it, which seemed unthinkable when you took over. And then how did your transition go into Vanity Fair? What was it?
Well, after Condé Nast bought it, I actually left because, after about a year, I left because I liked the whole scrappy maverick thing of being this outsider at the establishment, which is what Tattler was. We were the outsiders who were sort of scrappy and insurgent. And then when Condé Nast bought it and moved it into Hanover Square, I thought it was very, very boring and it became very dull. And Newhouse, who bought the magazine really because he loved what we were doing, was absolutely crushed it, really. He was so upset when I resigned from Tattler because, that's why he bought it.
Yeah.
So I then went off for a bit, but then rumours started to come that, he was starting this thing, Vanity Fair in New York, and they did start it. And it was a complete disaster, actually. I mean, they had 2 really failed editors immediately after a great deal of hype. There was huge hype that this thing was coming. It was going to be the best magazine. It was huge posters of it was coming back from the dead. And they spent millions of dollars on launching the new Vanity Fair. But the hype was much greater than the product, and it was a big failure. So then, they turned to me. They remembered that, I'd done Tattler. Obviously, I was recently left the company, and they said, come over and do it. And at first I went as a consultant. I didn't want to. I didn't want to do it at first. It was too much of a leap. Well, because it was too much of a leap. I just left Tattler. I didn't want to move to New York. And I said, I'll be a consultant. And I came as a consultant at first. And after a few months, I came to realize that the new editor that they'd put in just couldn't do it either. And I could see how I could change it, but I thought I'd missed the chance, actually. And I went back to England. And then 6 months later, they fired that editor and asked me to come back. So that's how I came in. And in fact, I was offered the job on vacation. I was in Barbados with Harry in the Christmas of 83 rather. And I got this phone call saying, would I come to New York for an interview? So I just said yes, even though I don't know where they thought I was, but I was actually on the beach in Barbados. And I came to New York. I had the interview with Si. He offered me the job, and he said, but you've got to start immediately after Christmas. So I never went home again for 3 years.
Gosh.
It was really, I mean, I just started with a wardrobe of cheesecloth sarongs and 2 bikinis.
Oh my God.
And Harry has always been so great like that. He said to me, absolutely must do it, and he just said, look, I'll go and, I'll go. He got a job immediately just teaching at an American university while he figured out what to do. But then he took over, eventually at Random House. So.
And what did you do first when you got there? What were your first? I mean, how early was the Dominic Dumb story? I mean, I don't know if people know, but I love this story. You tell it better than me, where you just sort of meet him at a dinner and. Yeah,
well, Dominic Dunn, I'd met him at a dinner party actually when I went as a consultant, and he was a film producer in those days, and he'd never actually written anything except a novel I think he'd written, and we got very close at dinner. He told me the horrendous story that his daughter had been murdered, and he was about to go out to LA for the trial of his daughter's murderer. He was a chef in a restaurant, and he strangled her in a sort of crime of passion. And I said to him, you really must keep a diary because it'll give you a lot of solace, and it might be that it's something that I could publish at Vanity Fair or suggest they do, if it came in after I'd gone back to London. So he went off to the trial, and I didn't think more about it. But then when I took over Vanity Fair, just as I came in, that piece came in, and it was a remarkable piece. I didn't publish it. Actually, it was published in the last piece before I took over, but it was the piece that I'd assigned. And it was an incredibly powerful, moving piece about the trial of his daughter's murderer. And it was true that he had an amazing voice. I sensed he had a voice because of the way he told stories.
Right.
So the first thing I did, really, within a few weeks of getting the job in January, was to ask Dominic Dunn to come in, and he was the first contract of anyone that I gave. I said, I must have some contract writers, and he's going to be the one. And I gave him a contract, and he was in from the very first issue.
Gosh, what a hype. And it's the 1980s in New York. Were there lots of sort of excitements and excesses? It was a particularly sort of unique time in sort of, were you living bonfire of the vanities?
Absolutely.
When you were going through your diaries recently, what struck you as the sort of...
Well, what really strikes you is just, I can't believe I was out all the time like that. I was out every single night. Every single night there was a black tie dinner. Every single night in people's homes. The idea of a black tie dinner in somebody's house now just seems completely insane. Yeah. But it was a wildly social time, and it took its cue from the Reagan White House, obviously. Nancy Reagan's world of the walkers like Jerry Zipkin and all of these, Pat Buckley, all these women. The Women's Wear Daily was this newspaper that chronicled their doings. It was the big social paper. Everybody wanted to be in it. And the Reagan White House was the center of the action. And then, of course, when you had Diana come into the White House to dance with John Travolta, that was the kind of apogee of the 80s moment, was Diana and John Travolta at the White House. It was the quintessential sort of 80s iconic moment.
Yeah, and a sort of visual gift for a magazine editor. It was all there.
Visual gift in every way. I wasn't invited to that occasion because I just published The Mouse That Roared. And so I was struck from that list. But It was a moment.
We were talking earlier, and I also noticed when I was reading this, you had both of your children while you were at Vanity Fair, and as you said in there earlier, you'd sort of become the thing not to really discuss it. But how did you manage this incredibly full-on out every night job and these?
Well, my diary again is full of that.
Did you? I mean,
it was the huge kind of juggle, the constant sort of juggle, and I had. I think we all lived like that, in a way. I mean, it's like I always rushed home for 6 o'clock to be with my children. Yes. I always had that sort of 6 to 9 was with the children, and then it was like into the black tie outfits, and out we went. I mean, that was the energy of that thing was incredible. I don't think we slept, But it was always an enormous juggle, and my son had a lot of difficulties too. So, he had Asperger's, and so which I didn't have a name then. So it was, that was also a huge challenge. My daughter wasn't born until right at the end of Vanity Fair. But, so it was crazy. And Harry was running Random House, so, there was a huge sort of 2-career drive in the house. But, one was just different, I guess.
Yeah, sure. And so how about you go from there to the New Yorker? Was that something you were very keen to do? How did that sort of...
Well, the New Yorker... started to loom sort of 3 years before I did it, actually. And actually, for 3 years, I sort of fenced it off a bit because I thought it would have a very bad impact on the family, because I just about could function with this monthly magazine and a child and another child. Yes. But then when the New Yorker came up, I thought, I don't want to have a weekly, this will just kill me. But I also knew that after 8.5 years at Vanity Fair, where we took it from 250,000 to 1.2 million, from 12 pages of ads to 250 pages, it became a huge juggernaut. And that was wonderful, and I could have stayed for 20 years. But, I'm never a lifer. I've never been a lifer. I like the doing and the making. And Cy Newhouse had bought the New Yorker, and he'd put in an editor who, as it turned out, didn't work. He was a very well-regarded...
What was the time frame? He bought it in...
He bought it in, I think it was 87.
And people were quite worried when he bought it, weren't they?
They were very worried. They shouldn't have been. I knew they shouldn't have been.
Yeah.
Because... I knew that he passionately loved the New Yorker. Cy read the New Yorker cover to cover, as he did all the magazines, which was one of the best things about him was he read everything. even including Glamour magazine, Self magazine, GQ. He read everything. It was wonderful the way he did, and he could talk as knowledgeably about any of those magazines as he could about the New Yorker, which he really worshipped. So I knew that he'd be a very good owner of the New Yorker, but for 2 years he left the legendary editor William Shawn in the job. Then he got impatient because the advertising was dying. It was aging. It hadn't changed for 40 years or something. And so he put in Robert Gottlieb, who was running Knopf at the time. And everybody thought that would be a great appointment. But Gottlieb wasn't a magazine man at all. He didn't really get magazines. And so after a couple of years, or 3 years, it was obvious that it wasn't improving. And so Cy then began to kind of torture himself about whether to put me into this job. And I went back and forth, and we did this dance for a couple of years, actually, And then finally I decided that it was too exciting to turn down. And for me, the critical thing was whether my parents would come and live with us, because then I knew that my children would be fully supported, which, bless them, they did. We bought the apartment across the landing, and they came and lived there, which was wonderful for the children. And I leapt in to sort of remake the New Yorker. And, it was an amazing experience because I was the first woman. It was a very sort of male shop. There's no doubt about that. And everybody saw me as the person who'd put a naked, pregnant Demi Moore on the cover of Vanity Fair, right? So they all thought, I was the Antichrist. And there were lots of sort of, inside the New Yorker, they were doing things like putting the New Yorker logo, Eustace Tilley, who's known as that mascot, they would replace his head with Demi Moore's breasts, and all sorts of things were going on, where they dreaded me. They thought I was an absolute antichrist. And I knew I wasn't that, because I also knew that, I had this whole other life where I'd been writing, very much more literary person, actually, than I was necessarily shown to be at Vanity Fair. And so the first beginning was very antagonistic towards me, but I had a real sense of what I was going to do. I knew what I was going to do. I'd thought about it then for quite a long time.
Right.
And I could see that the New Yorker was a sleeping beauty, A. And B, I also saw that the original New Yorker, as edited by Harold Ross in the 30s, as opposed to William Shawn in the 50s and 60s, was a very, very different animal to the magazine that was now seen to be the New Yorker. Actually, the Ross's New Yorker was much more alive, far more irreverent. The pieces were short and long. They weren't all these big, long, statuesque pieces. And, you know, it was a far more sort of altogether, had an adrenaline of news, actually. It was much more visual. It had wonderful cartoonists like Peter Arno and, you know, and Charles Addams, which would be used full page and not little cartoons. The covers were very irreverent, much more of the moment than they'd become, instead of those pictures of, you know, park benches with autumn leaves and stuff, which is what was happening at the New Yorker when I took over. So I had that image that I wanted it to go back to being Ross's New Yorker of the 30s. And that meant changing the lengths, visually doing a big makeover immediately. I introduced photographs which they'd never had before, not all the way through, but I put Richard Avedon only as the staff photographer, and his beautiful, pristine, you know, black and white images, which I thought fitted the New Yorker Caslon typeface, which is a very pure typeface. I added introductions, blurbs, you know, a contents page, which they didn't have. Made the covers a whole new lot of artists I brought in. I let go 70 writers and hired another 40. The 40 that I had were David Remnick, Malcolm Gladwell, you know, Jeffrey Toobin, Jane Mayer. I mean, I had some amazing writers, Anthony Lane, John Lahr. I had all those writers. And kept the best of their writers, which was John Updike and Roger Angell and Janet Malcolm and, you know, some of those wonderful writers. And I did actually find that the best of the old guard, like Updike, were very, very welcoming, actually. I mean, they'd wanted to be reactivated. But there was still a huge amount of hostility from, frankly, the people that I thought weren't particularly good, and who I thought were people who thought they were good because they were in the New Yorker, as opposed to being good, you know, because, as it were, you know, and they were just not good. And they didn't like me, and they went all out to sabotage me. But, you know, after a time, frankly, we won by just being really good, you know, and those writers that I brought in, like Remnick and like Gladwell and like, you know, they're fantastic, and they're still there. And, of course, David succeeded me as editor.
Yeah.
And, you know, it gelled after about 3 or 4 years.
So, like all brilliant editors, you're a great star spotter. I mean, we were talking about this earlier, but what else do you think a great magazine requires? You know, because people sometimes think, oh, it's just a few interesting pieces and some photographs. But how you've been so successful in reinventing, you know, you really understand the alchemy of a great magazine. Can you sort of explain it a little bit?
Well, I mean, the thing about a magazine is it's not just a bunch of articles with a staple through it. And some writers, a lot of editors think that it's a bunch of articles, right? And if you get a good bunch of articles, it's a good magazine. That is not true. There is a third element, which is the energy of visual presentation, headlines, captions, and the words, and the mix of those things. So sometimes, you know, you could put out a magazine, and I've done it myself and been very discontented at the end, when I have 6 or 7 incredible articles. I've got a wonderful issue this month, but it's not actually a good magazine. It lacks, you know, the energy of the light and shade. It lacks the texture of, you know, somehow, you know, the beautiful picture next to the gritty picture. It lacks the combination of some aggressive journalism with something extremely escapist or unexpected. It lacks pace. I mean, there's all sorts of things which go into making a really good magazine. And the people who know how to do it know that that's true, and a lot of it's instinctive, but there are some rules to it as well. I mean, and you know, you can, by assembling a team who understands that mix, they do kind of start to know what really makes it work. But I do feel that the presentation copy is something that's very underestimated sometimes. I mean, I would spend a tremendous amount of time writing contents pages, cover lines, captions, pull quotes. I would choose all the pull quotes for all the articles, which would be that killer quote that makes you want to read it. You know, that is the one quote that is intriguing, that makes you think, wow, I must read that piece, because the whole game is seduction. You know, you have to seduce people into picking it up, giving you the time. So I would just work so hard. Everything was about seduction. And the cover, of course, is a huge factor in that. And getting the right cover, you know when you've got it, and it's wonderful. Yeah. And it's always instant. I mean, covers that have to be reworked 20 times is never going to be any good. Either it comes in and it works, and it's immediate, or it doesn't. And I found that time and time again. What is really hard now, of course, is that none of these elements make a difference, which is what is really upsetting on the newsstand, which is, and the newsstand, okay, so you should care only really, I suppose, about subscriptions, but actually the newsstand always for me was the heart of the matter. It was always about how I was judged, and at the New Yorker, for instance, there was never really a newsstand sale until I came into the New Yorker, and nobody cared about the newsstand. It was a complete, because the subscriptions were really what it counted. Yeah. But I also knew that when I had a strong newsstand issue, that was the audience voting, that's when you got your Academy Award from the audience. And also, of course, it converted into new readers all the time, new readers, younger readers, because they bought it because they wanted to read that piece,
Yes, sure. So there you are at the New Yorker, and then, I know he came up earlier in the other talk, but here he looms back into the room, and then Harvey Weinstein, people, sort of seduces you away from the glories of Condé Nast. And how, sorry to put it like that, that just sort of
yes,
happened.
I know, listen, you want to really rub it in, don't you?
Yeah.
Well,
Sorry.
it was pretty much the most stupid thing I ever did in my life, let's face it. I mean, really the dumbest thing I ever did in my life. But, when people at the moment are saying, what a terrible person Harvey is, all of which is 100% accurate, nonetheless, okay, why did I go work for him, right? So there had to be aspects of him that were very appealing, and there are. I mean, at the time, I was fed up with the court of Condé Nast. I've been there for 18 years. I thought that the reason I left the New Yorker actually
What were you fed up? Yeah, sorry.
Well, I'll tell you why I left the New Yorker. I left the New Yorker because I wanted the New Yorker to be more than a magazine. And obviously, I was, in fact, wildly ahead of the curve on that, because I wanted it to be a radio show, a book. I said to Newhouse, this should be like the HBO of print, right? I wanted it to be more than just a magazine. And after nearly 7 years of editing it as a weekly, in my restive fashion, I wanted more expansion of this thing. And I felt that it could go into other avenues, books, films, so on. We were always selling articles in the magazine to films all the time, and I felt we should have our own film, boutique and so on.
Didn't someone try and get you to run a film studio or something?
Yes, I was offered that on several occasions. I didn't do it because of I didn't think it'd be great for the family. Right. So I thought it'd be interesting, and I was interested. But more than that, I thought the New Yorker should be that, and I frankly I was right. Okay, because only recently now have they started doing podcasts and all these things because. As it turns out, print is not enough. At the time, print was doing very well, but if they had done that, it would now be an amazing thing, frankly, to have had all these brand offshoots.
I think there's a film rights department as well now, isn't
there?
There
is, absolutely, finally, after sort of eight years ago, after 15 years of me wanting to do it. So at the time, anyway, so the time was the time, and I understand it, no one was really doing that. So I didn't want to do it, and he just basically said, pipe down and edit the magazine. So that should have been enough. But, Harvey came along and said exactly what I wanted to hear. He said, I think you should be doing more than this. You should now come. You don't have any stake. You're a salaried employee. I will make you a partner. I will give you a magazine where you can do all these things, right? And, and he was himself very visionary, let's face it. At the time that he offered me that job, he was at his best and his peak. He said to me, I've got a new film coming out. Why don't you come and watch while we look at it to cut it, right? So I said, okay. He said, it's called Shakespeare in Love, okay? So we sat down in this darkened, screening room and saw the rough cut, of Shakespeare in Love. And obviously, it was wonderful work. It was wonderful work. And actually, by the way, I will say for Harvey that he really does know film in a very interesting way. And when he talks about how to cut a film, shape a film, make a film better, it's like listening to a great editor talk about an article. So all those things, to me, were very appealing. Unfortunately, I didn't ask enough questions about what it was like to be working at Miramax. And as soon as the deal was done, and I did start to work for Harvey, it's Jekyll and Hyde.
Really, instantly?
Instant. I mean, once you get into the ogre's den, as it were, that's a pretty hairy scene. And I realized immediately I'd made a giant mistake because I just wasn't used to seeing the kind of volcanic profanity and crazy impulsiveness and irrational stuff that I was seeing. And also that he was no kind of a partner because he didn't understand magazines at all and thought that they were like movies, that they should be hits or you fold them, and of course...
I see. So he wasn't thinking long term, he was just
nothing.
sort of...
No, I mean, he thought it should be he jacked up the print order. The first issue was a huge success, and he jacked up the print order by 150,000 immediately, which was an insane thing to do because the next issue wasn't, and then it was like, then he's in a rage, So it was very, very difficult and painful, actually. But I did learn a huge amount, too. I learned a lot from him, I have to admit, too, because, he is the master marketer of all time.
What did you learn from him? What kind of... what does
probably nothing good. He's a brilliant marketer.
Yeah.
He really is.
Yeah.
He actually understands exactly how you should go about building, interest and being so obsessive and intense about it. It was he could be impressive. And also just his grasp of material and things. I did learn quite a lot. But most of what I learned was never ever to work for anybody like that again.
And tell us a little bit about the party. You once described it as the end of the 20th century. Will you describe, when I don't want to read out what you wrote about it, so will you just tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, the launch of Talk magazine
story,
was one of the great epic follies that I'll never regret, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
and it was a combination, by the way, of the Harvey madness and my madness at the most unwise, shall we say. It actually began with a typical Harvey incident, which was the first issue of Talk was coming out, and I had Hillary Clinton for the cover. It's amazing how Hillary Clinton and Di have been on every magazine I've ever done.
Sure.
But anyway,
they travel with you.
We had Hillary Clinton for the cover because she was running for the Senate. And we were going to give our launch party at a place called the Brooklyn Navy Yards, which is a city site in New York. And it was going to be a cocktail party, a book party, in a sense, for the launch of Talk magazine in the August of 1999. And then Rudy Giuliani was running for the Senate, as he was mayor at the time, and he was running for the Senate, and his bitter enemy was Hillary Clinton. So when he heard that we had Hillary Clinton on the cover, he threw us out of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which was an astonishing thing to do, quite honestly. Well, Harvey, at his best, of course, said, "Fuck you, Rudy Giuliani. You are not going to throw us out of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We're going to go to a federal site for a party where you have no hold." So he said, "Where should we go?" So I said, "Well, I don't know, Statue of Liberty." So he said, "Great, let's do it there." Right, so we went over in this ferry. No one had ever given a party at the Statue of Liberty, actually. It was Liberty Island. There wasn't any lighting there. There's no lights on it. And he thought it was a great idea. I thought it was a great idea. And we, I went into overdrive. And so we took over Liberty Island, and we strung all these fairy lights and lanterns all over it. And we had Macy Gray, who was then an unknown talent, come and be the band. And we had George Plimpton doing the fireworks.
Who'd done munitions after the Second World War, I read, or something.
The what?
He'd learned in the munitions department of the Second World War.
Very likely, or I'm sure he said that he had, anyway.
Right.
So you had this wonderful plummy voice of George Plimpton going, "There's a Catherine wheel to remember," And, it was an amazing evening, and everybody came over on this huge ferry, and then Harvey went into overdrive and brought every single Miramax star on that ferry. So it was like a Noah's Ark of celebrity madness. It was like 2 by 2 they came, Madonna and Henry Kissinger and Demi Moore and, George Plimpton. It was like, they all came off this ferry and they all stayed all night. And it was absolutely amazing. And then we sailed back in the morning. There was Cape Moss and God knows what, and we all sailed back. And I remember thinking, there was a big wave that washed over us as we sailed off on that last ferry with Natasha Richardson was on the ferry, and Kate Moss and Helen Mirren, oh my God. And I remember thinking, this is incredible. This is like, I've never seen anything like this. And, when I think back, we sailed past the Twin Towers, which of course came down within the next year and a half. Natasha Richardson is now no longer with us. And that cold wave was also sort of the end of the 90s. The 21st century has never been the same, in America since the Twin Towers came down, since 9/11, which I watched from outside Talk magazine with my staff. We stood out in the street and watched those planes go into those towers downtown. And it was an extraordinary thing to feel that suddenly your whole world had changed. And it happened in Fashion Week, actually, when all the Talk staff were out at Fashion Week, and the contrast between going to Fashion Week the night before and seeing, all of these people. There was Donald Trump. I sat in front of Donald Trump, actually, at that event. Behind me was Donald Trump and Monica Lewinsky, right, at this Marc Jacobs show. And it was this quintessential 20th century feeling of this era of opulence. Nothing was ever going to change. This was New York. It was all wild. Next day, the same people were giving blood. Everything was done. And it's never been the same since, really.
No, gosh. And so, well, before we get on to the Daily Beast after talk, and indeed your Diana book, there's, you've always had this amazing ability to, so after the horrors of Harvey, you pick yourself up and you just keep going. And I read that you once sort of attributed that quality to your mother.
Well, my mother had a great sense of humour, hugely strong. My father really was the one who was picking himself up because he was a film producer and he was constantly reinventing. And, film producers, really? It's what I like about film producers, actually, is that there's never a job, right? You have to invent it every day. But I also just wanted to go back into my own world. I felt having had this horrible interface with bad power.
Yes.
I really then just wanted to recover who I was, and that meant going into myself and being a writer again. And I had a wonderful 2 years. I mean, Harry and I, my daughter just went off to boarding school at that time, actually, and we stayed in our house in Long Island in Quogue, and he wrote his book, My Paper Chase, and I wrote my book on Diana, and it was a marvellous time. I mean, we often talk about that was almost one of our happiest times because we were sort of hibernating, hiding, enjoying being introverts. I loved actually coming to London a lot and retracing the Diana era because, in a way, I was also retracing my girlhood at Tattler and remembering the era of the 80s and understanding it as an adult, really. So it was a wonderful time.
It's such a wonderful book, it really is. Now, one of the writers here, one of the novelists, said the thing about Tina is she could have been a writer all throughout the whole of her career. She's an amazing, brilliant writer, which you are. So did you get sidetracked into editing, or could you just not quite, did you just love it as well, or...
Well, actually, as you'll see, I mean, I've taken most of this stuff out of the diary because being introverted is boring to read from other people's point of view. But the big theme of my diary is always that push and pull about being an outer and an inner person, Right. And, I mean, I'm very, I am a woman of the arena, as they say. I mean, I like being the sort of, I like the blood sport of action. I'm a bit of an action junkie. And to be a writer, you've really got to give up the action and go in. And I love doing that, and I need that. But then I get seduced out by sort of the action again. And in some ways, chronicling that action is perhaps also what I do best. So maybe that's what I should be doing. But I've, I do love I love collaboration. Actually, I'm a huge collaborator. I mean, one of the things you'll see in my book that's coming is just my sort of love of making magazines, the team, the whole excitement of bagging the story, working late. There's nothing more exciting and wonderful than working towards the close of a magazine's deadline. It was like putting on a play. I mean, I've written plays and put plays on too, and I love, putting on a play is so exciting and so fun. It's this team and you're all working together. One of my writers at Vanity Fair said, who I used to work with a lot, Stephen Schiff, he's now head of the writers' room for The Americans, the TV show at Fox, and he said it's just like the old days at Vanity Fair. It's really fun. It's just a bunch of creative people kicking ideas around. And I do love doing that. I really do.
The best diaries always annoy people. Do you think, are there going to be people who are annoyed when your diaries come out?
Well, there might well be. I mean, there's quite a few of the big people that I make a lot of fun of are no longer with us. I mean, there'll be a few people who I would say might be a little cool when it comes to dinner parties. But I've tried to make it a sort of, it's not a diary which dishes in that sense. It's a diary that observes the speed and a moment, in a sense.
So you're also looking at your younger self. Do you feel like you've changed since then? The way?
Very much so. I mean, I think I'm much more. I think I'm much more reflective really now than I was. Certainly less sort of. I mean, I was just so driven. I mean, I must say. I mean, I've always been driven, but I was really driven to win. That's what I was. I really wanted to make it work, and just. There was nothing but that, really. That and obviously my children and husband, but that was what dominated my world.
When you were writing about Diana, what did you, in the end, did you feel sorry for her, admiring of her? I mean, we just had another anniversary, the 20th anniversary. What do you
Well, actually, I feel more and more
think now? What do you...
now. I mean, now that I'm the mother of a 26-year-old girl, I cannot imagine what it must have been like for Diana at 19. When I think of my daughter at 19, I mean, the idea of putting her in the situation that Diana was in, to me, is now absolutely inconceivably cruel, And funnily enough, at the time, I mean, perhaps because I was 25 and she was 19, I didn't see her as so... It's like a child bride. This is like a child marriage. I mean, it was so grotesquely unkind, really, what she was put into. And I do tend to feel more and more as the years go by that it was that, she was put into arranged marriage, but she was the only person who didn't know it. And so in a sense, she was sort of gaslighted. I don't mean that the royal family were knowingly cruel, but it was a setup from the word go. And she was the only fool that didn't understand that this man she saw it in romantic terms, they saw it in arrangement terms. And that brutal disparity and dissonance was eviscerating for her. And she was already, I think, a very highly strung. Again, her mother left her when she was 6. I mean, that is a brutal thing to happen to you. So I think she was extraordinarily raw and wildly unfit for the situation that she was in. And I mean, I don't think it improved her character to be in the situation either. I mean, desperate unhappiness combined with wild celebrity doesn't make anybody a better person, if you like. But I will say that I think that she genuinely found a way to sublimate her pain into something extraordinary, and that her love of, her care about and her humanitarian connection was not in any way phony. It was a real thing, and that everyone who was touched by her really felt the power of her genuine compassion and her interest. And she really showed a way to reinvent celebrity, actually, where she showed how, she has blazed the way for these celebrity humanitarians to understand that they can do something with their fame, So in that sense, I think she also becomes more and more important as an icon.
So is that why she's so enduringly fascinating, do you think? Because the 20th anniversary...
I do. I mean, I think, yes, I do, actually. I mean, I actually often think we miss Diana very much. I mean, in something like the refugee crisis. I mean, does anyone have any doubt that she would have been at Calais? Diana would have been in, she would have been so involved with the refugees. She would have been so involved in Syria. She had such an amazing ability to bring that limelight. And I mean, the woman walked through a field of unexploded landmines in Angola. I mean, that was an extraordinary thing to do when you think about it. And not only that, not that she only didn't do it once, she went back when they didn't get the pictures and did it again. She had a remarkable, crazy courage and a deep, deep desire to take that pain and make it into something else.
A risk taker, really.
She was, and I think that was amazing. And I think she taught the royal family a tremendous amount. I think that she busted open, and she changed monarchy. And her children really are...
I was going to say, William, Harry, Kate,
absolutely.
Where do you see them?
I think that they are the result of her parenting. I think she was a very good mother, a loving mother, who broke her children out of this horrible royal trap of being sort of effigy people. And those boys are, they're real people, and they've made a great connection. And, it was a great gift that she gave. So I think she'll grow in stature. And I think that actually as the boys age as well, more and more, as you saw in the anniversary, they're really kind of, their mother is no longer this kind of, subject that everybody painfully avoids. Now they're basically celebrating her more and more.
Yes, and talking about mental health at the same time, they sort of turned it into a sort of very good discussion, didn't they? And the Daily Beast. So then you sort of tackle online head on, along with Newsweek. What was your vision for the?
Well, the Daily Beast was to me the Daily Beast was Tattler on speed. I mean, it was just exactly like that. I having had the collapse at Talk and been excoriated and trashed on the front page of the New York Post and everything, I felt failure is very liberating, because you just feel, oh well, the worst has happened. I mean, I actually think Harvey Weinstein might end up feeling, you know what, all that spinning, all that lying, it's done. Everybody knows the worst of me, So I felt sort of slightly like that after Talk. And so I was able to do the Daily Beast with a real irresponsible glee. I felt, this is really fun. I'm just going... Barry Diller, who is a big sort of media guy, said to me, why don't you start an online news site. And I didn't think I'd be interested in it really because I was a print person. But then I found, working with a digital art director, that no one had actually done a really a news site with all the adrenaline, but also a very visually glamorous. I mean, the Daily Beast looked great. Doesn't now, they've gone and spoiled the design of it. It did look really fabulous, I thought. I mean, I really had a news site that looked somehow like a upscale tabloid, which is what I felt it was. And the joy of it is it's like having a fish on a hook when you have a piece of traffic. I mean, the first time that we published a piece by Christopher Buckley about how he was going to support Obama as a big Republican, it was a huge piece of news in 2008, suddenly you had all these people, you could see the traffic. I mean, we had a traffic map, and you saw, it was like having all these fish on hooks, just sort of, 5,000, 10,000, 11, 20,000. And suddenly it was like 150,000 people had sort of were there. And we also had a wonderful map, a sort of digital map, which showed lights all over the world where people were reading things. It was very exciting. You felt hugely connected. And it was something commensurate to my own impatience at last. I could actually sit in the diner in the morning with Harry, where we always go, with my BlackBerry, as I then had, not my iPhone, and I was able to commission 20 pieces at breakfast. Just say,
so news
you must do you must got to do this piece about the whacking of whatever on, the jihadist or whatever. And boom, within 3 hours, some wonderful piece would arrive from somebody at a think tank or something. And I found that so gratifying. I never really did anything but sit there with my BlackBerry for sort of doing these assignings. And I loved it, actually. It was so much fun. And we got, we went from nothing to, 30 million. And that was a very exciting thing. And then, typically, wasn't enough, So Barry Dillon then heard that, that Newsweek was going.
Yes.
It was actually stumbling and had failed and, was virtually dead on arrival. And we could acquire it for not very much money. And, what about combining it with the Daily Beast? It was actually a flawed concept. And in fact, I felt going back to print after doing digital, it was like having an affair with your ex-husband. It was just sort of, you suddenly remembered why you'd left,
Yeah.
And I'm done with print now. I don't, it's like I'd moved on, and it was a crazy regression into thinking, wouldn't it be great to be able to assign long, big pieces about, no, it's not, because nobody's going to buy it at the newsstand, there'll be no advertising to pay for it, and forget it, it's a dream, right? So that was a dream that faded rather quickly.
And so where did the concept of women in the world came into your mind from? Where did you...
Well, Women in the World I launched while I was at the Daily Beast, actually.
So.
Well, I mean, I'm on the board of Vital Voices, which is an NGO which mentors women in emerging countries. And I went to one of their retreats, actually, in 2009, and just met all these incredible women, right? Women from Africa, India, women who are facing down child marriage, female genital mutilation, jihadism, all this stuff was happening. And I found these women were absolutely charismatic and amazing. And I thought, how nobody ever hears from them. We never see the story of the world through the eyes of women, right? I mean, you read all these incredible stories. Where are the women telling their stories? They're on the ground. They are always at the front line of any drama that's happening anywhere. And we always read about it from the point of view of a sort of news account that's distant or written by men, or the men are the men and the voices. You never hear really what it's like to be a real human being in the middle of all this stuff. So I thought how great it would be to have a conference, a summit, that would bring together these amazing voices and give them a platform of their own and make them into stars. And so we did. I got a sponsor to agree to it, and I launched it at a small theatre in New York. And also, of course, you had to have big names because nobody comes to see people they've never heard of. And I must say for Hillary Clinton, she came to the very first Women in the World, and she has been everyone since, actually. Except for 1 year when she was campaigning. Meryl Streep was my co-host. And we got all these amazing women to come, and it just went off immediately unbelievably well. One of our first speakers was Lema Bowie, who started the Liberian insurrection which it helped to get rid of Charles Taylor, the despot in Liberia. And she's an amazing figure. She's kind of like a sort of Oprah figure. And she had all these women in their white T-shirts who just did this giant sit-in Liberia. And at one point they stripped everything off just to make a demonstration. She's an incredible figure. And she came to the first summit, and we had an amazing woman who had a radio station which recorded the rape victims in Congo, and she just telling their testimonies on her radio show, and she would just play them, and we played them in the dark theatre with subtitles, which was unbelievably powerful stuff. So it was immediately very, very well received. 300 people loved it, and within 3 years we had 2,500 people at Lincoln Center, and it basically took off as the annual Women in the World Summit. And since then it's really become, the sort of, I hate to use words like premier platform, but it has become the premier platform for women of substance telling their stories.
Oh, it's a wonderful
It's a wonderful thing, and it's very cutting edge in terms of news. I mean, this past year in April we had an amazing panel about the rise of white supremacy, which is way before Charlottesville. We had an undercover cop who has penetrated white supremacy gatherings. We had the mother of one of the victims of Dylan Roof, the killer in South Carolina who murdered everybody in that church. I mean, we had these two incredible Syrian doctors who were working, in these underground hospitals in Aleppo, and at the same time, we also had Hillary came back, gave her first interview after the trail. Yeah. We had Justin Trudeau, because we do want to celebrate men who are champion, and he was wonderful. And he invited us to Toronto to start the conference in Toronto, and we did it, just did it in September. We did the Women in the World's first summit in Toronto in September, which was great. We've now done it in London, India. So now so after the Daily Beast, I left and I started to do Women in the World full time, because I decided it was the most exciting thing, and it was a way to do journalism it was live journalism. It's a way to do journalism, tell stories, and get away from the whole kind of nightmare of, delivery systems and platforms and traffic and all of this agony that beleaguers journalism.
And I can see that when you're planning it, you're editing it, you're thinking of the mix and the stories But on Hillary Clinton, because you've been a great supporter of hers, and I just want to talk a little bit about her and Trump, because I read this hilarious description. You said that Trump was like the family. They looked like the Kardashian Camelot, and there they were, these beautiful women, and you said it was a show people wanted to watch, and the Clintons talking about healthcare wasn't. I mean, how much do you think Hillary, suffered through image, really, or because you've been watching?
Well, it was a perfect storm. I mean, look, nobody could. When you think about it was just a perfect storm for Hillary, really. She has never been a good campaigner. She was always someone who was going to be good when she got in, but was never good at getting there, which is always the problem. And actually, I would say now to anybody who's thinking of going into politics, if you don't have telegenic skills, if you're not a great communicator, just don't even run, right? Because we are now such a media world that if you cannot be that person, you really shouldn't even try. So it was always a big handicap for Hillary that she just was never great at that. She's actually a very powerful speaker when she's passionate. But she was not a good campaigner, and she knows it, and it makes her nuts that she isn't, and it makes everybody around her nuts, but she's not. Okay, so she still could have got there, but she's up against something that no one knew how to deal with. You saw Trump defeat all of the other Republicans around him, because they didn't know how do you take on somebody who is this reality show star who is so already, which I think nobody really thought about. Because we all don't really necessarily watch The Apprentice, we didn't understand in America, the people, the kind of commentariat and the journalists, because they really weren't The Apprentice audience. They didn't understand that The Apprentice was an indelible image of a great success. That Trump, it doesn't matter, all these articles written about the fact that, which is all true, that he is like the Harvey Weinstein of real estate. It's all smoke and mirrors, it's all nonsense, a lot of it. He, was a terrible businessman, really, sent things bankrupt and so on. Doesn't matter. Man with a gold tower called Trump Tower, man with a huge aeroplane that may be old and falling apart, but it's still his own aeroplane. Man with gorgeous models, everybody with long blonde hair, short skirts. And P.S., there are plenty of women who would like to sit by the pool in dark glasses. The notion that all women want to be strivers and achievers who just hate the idea of it's not true. There are plenty of women who want to be Melania Trump and Ivanka Trump. And plenty of men, lots, who want to be Mr. Big Shot with a big plane and a wife and so on. So he was the absolute very image of success, and not the kind of success you can't understand either. People don't understand what bankers do. People don't understand what digital people do, but they understand a guy who sells real estate and builds a gold tower and says you're fired. So he masqueraded as the big, tough boss that was going to put things to right.
Right.
And Hillary was this, lecturing feminist bluestocking who thought she could make the world, she was a make the world betterite in an annoying way. A lot of women never forgave Hillary for not leaving Bill. I mean, this was one of the horrible things that Hillary had to deal with, that here she has this grotesque misogynist, ghastly, woman disrespecter, and she can't really use it because her own husband, Bill Clinton, had Monica Lewinsky in the Oval Office, which you could argue was almost more shocking than Trump, who was, using that kind of language on that tape. And of course, every time she sort of tried to negotiate that, because she's a genuine, huge feminist and huge supporter of women who's cared so much about all these causes, she couldn't use the very thing that she could have made, Michelle Obama could. Michelle Obama could make wonderful speeches about how disrespected women felt. Yes. But sort of Hillary found it very difficult to speak about it, because every time she opened her mouth, somebody would say, your husband, these, and Trump even produced his ex-girlfriends, the women who'd all accused Trump or Clinton or said they'd slept with Clinton, and he put them in the debating room. So that Hillary had to look up, it was the horriblest thing that he did, when he summoned up all those women who had slept with Bill Clinton and stuck them in front of her nose. So she had to debate in front of those women. And Bill Clinton, I never forget the way he looked at that lineup of these kind of hellish mistakes of his own past. But it was something that, was very vivid, unfortunately.
Yeah. And where are you? You've interviewed Theresa May as well, haven't you, Women in the World? What do you think about her and her televisual skills?
I mean, well, that's exactly right. I mean, I don't understand why she put herself in a position of campaigning when she didn't have to. I have to say that I felt, I wasn't in the room and I wasn't in the country when the unbelievably epic sort of Monty Python conference happened. But I felt incredibly sort of sorry for her with the coughing attack. I mean, it was just so brutal. And it felt almost as if she was being bullied. I felt this was a person now. It had gone beyond being amusing, and I felt her being sort of bullied in a way. And I thought it was painful, actually, and sad. And, I just see the pile-on of mistakes is heartbreaking, really.
No, I agree. I wonder if we've got time for a few brief questions. If anyone, look, there's some over here.
Happy to.
Should we go?
When people keep on saying that Hillary Clinton lost the election to Trump, as we all know, she actually got over 2 million more votes than Trump.
3, actually.
3. What does she ever talk to you about that? The fact that she may have lost the electoral college, but actually won the popular vote, and how she feels about that?
Well, she feels really bitter about it. I mean, one of the things that I think was very hard for her to take, actually, was, with the Women's March on Washington, which was the biggest single one-day protest ever in American history, when all of the women marched in January. I mean, I think her attitude was, where were you? Because, women did not, vote in the kind of numbers that she thought they would for her. Many of them stayed home because of Jim Comey, the releasing the notification that he was going to look at her emails again. That absolutely did, it's true, dampen her win. And I do believe that she's correct on that. She strongly feels that he was responsible for her losing. I don't know that he was responsible for her losing. I think she might have squeaked it over the edge, but for that. But I also think, a lot of women went with Bernie Sanders, and I think a lot of women took her for granted in a strange way. And it was only when she lost that there was an enormous upsurge of women feeling particularly, holy Christ, what have we done to ourselves here? We had all these carps and criticisms of Hillary. We found her, a lot of women would say, she's dishonest or whatever. And then instead they get Trump, who is macro aggression, not microaggression, a macro aggression. and they realised that they made a terrible mistake. There's a lot of guilt, actually, amongst liberal women, really, about the fact that they didn't vote for her last time. And I think that's very hard for her, actually. I think she feels let down by that. But, you know, she's a remarkably strong person, you know, and she's still out there fighting, and, you know, she will not be crushed by it. She will continue to be a voice in some way, but it's been hard.
I wonder if you've ever visited the scene of Diana's death, Tunnel de Alma in Paris.
I have, yes, indeed. And in fact, I had a different beginning to my book until I went to Paris and walked her whole last 24 hours, as it were. I went down the elevator, the same elevator she went down, in the service elevator in the Ritz, and walked past that corridor in the Ritz, which has all of those expensive scarves and perfumes and things in the display cabinets, and came out and then drove in the car into the Alma Tunnel. And it's...
There is a colonnade, columns without a crash barrier, like the ones behind you. And so if the car veers at all, it will hit one of those, it'll hit a colonnade, and it's virtually like a head-on collision. And it's still like that today without a crash barrier. And so her death was actually entirely unnecessary to my mind, because if had there been a crash barrier, it would have kept the car on the straight and narrow. At least it would have been damaged, but not the equivalent of a head-on collision.
That's very, very sad to hear, but she also wouldn't have died if she had worn a seatbelt, which is also one of the most incomprehensible things about her death that I still cannot understand, that she didn't wear a seatbelt. You know, that her own security detail had a seatbelt on, but she didn't. Why? She always her sister... Well, no, her sister always says, actually, her sister has said, she was absolutely rigid about that. She always put a seatbelt on, always wore a seatbelt. So I just don't understand why she did it that night.
Anyone else? Drive?
10 or 20 years' time onwards, will there be a place in the media for an editor like you who has vision, hires great writers, great photographers, cares about design?
Who's this voice?
It's me.
Okay, thank
Over
you.
here.
Yeah.
Or will everything in the new digital media world be very much more run by Google bots?
You know, I think there are a lot of great editors around. There's a lot of very good digital editors, actually. The skill set you require for a magazine are a different mix of things. But I think, of course, there's a lot of great skill in video and other forms of you know, there's a great podcasts, video, there are all of these other medias that are now extremely, you know, vibrant and require other kinds of skills. So I don't know about that particular magazine making skill. But on the other hand, you know, frankly, for kids who are born digital now, magazines start looking rather vintage and rather interesting. And paper might get hip 20 years from now. Who knows?
Great.
I mean, it could come back in a strange way. But it probably won't, just because it's all about distribution, you know, the expense of... I mean, I remember the incredible fact that the Newsweek cost $30 million to do before you published anything, which was about getting it out, you know, distributing it, printing it, the cost of it, the whole thing. It's very, very expensive. So I don't know. I think film is where it's at. I think actually documentaries are where it's at. A lot of the best journalists I know now are making documentaries. So
Is that what you're going to do next?
You know, I don't know that I would make a documentary, but I do think there's a lot of talent, very interesting talent in it, and some great stuff. I mean, things like Making of a Murderer, which I'm sure lots of people have seen. It's so incredible and so addictive. You know, there's so many great documentaries being done. So I think that's where it's really going, is documentary film.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much,
Tina.
What a pleasure.